Festival. We're going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes of time for you guys to ask questions. And we very much hope you'll join in the discussion, because I think it's a really interesting, provocative book in many ways. But I'm going to introduce Jasmine first of all. So her books include Losing Israel, which won Non-Fiction Wales Book of the Year, The Greatest Need, a biography of the author Lily Tobias, the monograph Whose People, Wales, Israel, Palestine, and 2 collections of poetry, Self-Portrait as Ruth and Misappropriations. Her works appeared in The Guardian, in the New York Times, and her documentary Statue Number 1 was broadcast on Radio 4. She's a part-time professor of creative writing at Swansea University and a fellow of the Learned Society of Wales. Birdsplaining, her latest book, has been featured at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, the Oxford Literary Festival and the Hay Festival, and was selected for Wales Literature Exchange's 2023 bookshelf, the Frankfurt Book Fair. So it's making some waves. But before we start the conversation, I thought it was worth telling you an anecdote about how we met, even though we didn't know each other. So I reviewed this book earlier this year and put it on Facebook, and my stepdaughter's dad got in touch and said, I used to work with Jasmine's dad, and my daughters used to go and play in her garden, and Anna was so impressed with Jasmine as a slightly older girl that she just wanted to be Jasmine, right?
I didn't know that.
So we had this amazing connection, and it goes way back beyond that as well, so we haven't got time to get into all that, unfortunately. But anyway, so to open then, I guess I'm interested in the title. And we've got kind of, so why this title? And what was the main idea behind the writing of the book? And do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, the title, everyone can hear me okay? The title obviously is a play on the word mansplaining. And it's supposed to be humorous. But I think it can also be a bit provocative, and some people take against it. There's an assumption about what I'm doing with that title. So yes, it's a play on mansplaining, which, as some of you will know, splain is a very adaptable suffix. So this was my version of it. So yes, on one level, it addresses a tendency among certain people to provide expertise that hasn't been asked for, and to presume that others, particularly women, are not expert, and to presume to explain things that they might not need to explain. But at the same time, it also points to just the centrality of birds in my life, throughout my life, and me trying to understand certain things through birds. I'm not an ornithologist. I'm a fairly amateur bird watcher. I don't have an expertise, but birds are hugely important to me and always have been. So it's a way also of just asking some questions and reflecting on some larger questions through birds and seeking to understand the world through birds.
And yet you do. I think you're putting yourself down a bit, because you do have a phenomenal knowledge about species. I mean, it's all there, which is a great joy for me. But were you aware that you were writing a book, or did it begin as just a collection? How did you orientate yourself into the book? It
had its origins in failure, actually. I went through a period of not being able to get something published, and not being able to get grants, and not being able to do this, that, and the other. So there was definitely a sort of loss of confidence in myself as a writer, and I decided, right, well, I've got to finish something. And this competition was coming up, the New Welsh Writing Awards. I thought, and it was a prose competition. I thought, I'm just going to pull something together for this deadline in March. It's a deadline, it'll be a kick up the arse to get something written and finished. And I almost didn't submit it. I did cobble together this sort of 15,000 words of loosely connected things. And in fact, I did submit it in the end, and it won. And the prize for the competition was book publication, and a very nice sum of money as well, which was very welcome.
Always welcome.
Always
as a poor
welcome.
writer.
So I then needed to develop what was about 15,000 words into a book. And initially I was thinking of something quite different. It was sort of an exploration of all sorts of themes, and it came together the way it came together. So the original work is in there in slightly different form, and a lot of it was drafted new for the purposes of this book. It was clear that birds was going to be the sort of the driving
narrative thread.
image. Yeah. But it surprised me. I mean, it took me all sorts of directions I was not at all anticipating, and I learned a lot actually about myself in the process of writing it.
Yeah, well, isn't it? Because I took it with me. My husband and I booked a cottage in the Borders last December. It was the coldest house I've ever had the misfortune of staying in. But I took your book with me, and I started to read it, and I think it's fair to say I didn't quite get it at first, and I was carrying on, and then I thought, right, okay. It's not a book about birds, actually. It's a book about human nature. It's about how we're all entangled with these kind of different threads about nature, and you interrogate lots of issues that we'll come on to. But do you want to tell us initially about some of the landscapes that feature in the book and what you were doing by being there? I mean, I'm thinking about, I really like the piece about nightjars, and nightjars are kind of... they're an idiosyncratic species that are not easy to see, and they're very otherworldly and uncanny. So do you want to say something about that, for example?
Yeah, well, it's a series of interconnected essays, and it's primarily located where I'm located, which is in rural Mid Wales, not that far from Aberystwyth, for those of you who know Mid Wales at all. It's a pretty bleak, rough, upland kind of place. It's very unromantic, in a capital R romantic, in terms of landscape. You know, it's boggy upland, there's wind turbines, there's kind of shaly outcrops. It's not even exciting, dramatic.
Sounds wonderful.
Rock landscape. It is wonderful, but it's not the sort of landscape with a capital L that is romanticized. So a lot of my thinking and writing is taking place in that environment. My house is an environment as well. It's also a landscape. It's a very porous house, and I expect we'll get onto that. Very, very old stone cottage, and it backs onto my garden. My garden backs onto really unchanged bit of woodland, bit of scraggy woodland. So everything's a bit damp, a bit wet, a bit boggy, a bit unlooked after in the best possible way when it comes to the natural world. And then a bit further afield, there's a forestry area that's been clear cut, which is where there are nightjars every year, pretty much guaranteed, and which is also just about the most un-nature writing kind of landscape. It's not, Forestry Commission, serried ranks of trees. It's about the most unhealthy environment for the natural world in so many ways. But once it's been clear cut, the kinds of things that start to emerge and that start to adapt and take over, and then of course it doesn't stop there. So I don't know how long the nightjars are going to be there, because all of that clear cut is now growing up. And Pembrokeshire coast. There's also a bit in California. I lived in California for many years. A bit in Scotland. I spent some time traveling in Scotland. So a number of different landscapes, but primarily thinking about all these things through the lens of largely where I live.
And I think it's really successful. You kind of get the impression that you know it really, really well, and that you're kind of at home there. But keeping the nightjar theme, there's a moment in the book where you go out in the evening to look for these crepuscular birds. They come out. They're more evident in the dusk, aren't they? But then you're a woman walking alone in the countryside, and there's a moment where I think you meet a family and then you're on your own in this place and then you see a man and you talk about, so, I mean, we're going to move on to talk about gender issues in bird watching, but do you want to describe that, what happened there where you know, what's that like for a woman in that kind of landscape? Because it's not avoidable, right? It's a real thing.
No, it's, it's, I mean, I stand corrected by a generalization I've made before that all women, or most women, you know, have to do a certain amount of risk assessment if they're going to go out on their own anywhere out the front door, whether you're living in an urban environment or in a rural environment, or if you're parking your car somewhere and going for a walk, you know, you do a risk assessment. I think somebody told me at an event, never happens, never think about it, never felt unsafe. I was like, great, lucky you. But I think for many women, consciously, deliberately, or maybe less consciously, there is that kind of antenna that you know, your antenna are up for threat in a way that perhaps most men don't experience. And so when it gets reinforced, as it often does, it can make wild places inaccessible for women. And it's something that has, particularly in this last year, been really talked about a lot more, this whole question of access and increased access, not just for women, people with disabilities. I mean, it just the question of who has access to wild places without even thinking about it. You know, the kinds of barriers that really are there.
And conversations we need to have.
Conversations we really need to have. And, you know, it's not, you can't make it totally accessible for everybody, but you know, one of the ways of dealing with it is also people who do have that easy access maybe being a bit more aware of women alone in the landscape and how they behave with respect
and
to
in this case,
women.
this gentleman just
man coming towards me, and he moved to the side of the path
with his dog,
greeted me really warmly, said it was a lovely evening, and walked on fast. You know, he was signaling to me he was going for a walk on his own. Whereas if he had paused, if he had turned and looked at me, if he had come right at me in that space at that time, perhaps, you know, I would have read it very differently. But he consciously or unconsciously recognized that he needed to adapt his behavior. So.
And then we're going to talk about one of the early essays in the book, which is called Field Guides. And I absolutely loved what you did with this essay. And it raises themes of gender and the way we overlook things we have done up until, I mean, things have improved, but I'll let you briefly describe it, and then I think you might read a little bit from that section of the book.
It's a chapter or an essay called Field Guides, and it's structured around my discovery of a book in the local secondhand bookshop that I suddenly realized we'd had when I was a very young child. And, you know, when you see an object that you haven't seen since you were maybe almost pre-verbal, there's just an extraordinary feeling of excitement and recognition, and you're sort of sent back to being that age for a moment. So, of course, I bought this book, even though it was a very out-of-date book. This essay was sort of about my realization, looking at that book, about how birds were depicted. And
it's a kind of unthought known, isn't it? Once we get this, we've got it, but until it's pointed out, often we don't. So do you want to...
Yeah, I suppose this is sort of a content warning or a trigger warning, really. It may change your attitude to your own beloved field guide. I have had people come up to me and say, "Oh, you've ruined it for me. I can never look at my Collins guide the same way." This was an old Hessian covered. It was 1956, I think, its original publication. Because my family were big bird watchers, so I'll read a passage. "Birds were so much the natural order of things when I was a child that I never noticed it, and the field guide was so much part of the natural order that I internalized its patterns and relationships without ever noticing them either. But now, when I open the book again at random on a page of finches, the red bullfinch, pale linnet, redpoll, twite, grosbeak, and crossbill, those patterns and relationships stand out starkly and are impossible to ignore. In each illustration, except that of the twite, the female is perched behind the male. Where his posture is upright, bold, declarative, she's bent over, submissive and demure. The twite is represented only by a single bird identified as male, although like the bullfinch and redpoll, the male and female twite differ from one another. Overleaf, the hawfinch, brambling, greenfinch, and siskin are depicted the same way, with a horizontal female behind the upright male, while the goldfinch and citralfinch each show one bird with the note "sexes similar." Elsewhere, it's even more marked. The male always appears in the foreground, upright, and the female is horizontal or dipped downward or even crouched down in the position she might assume for mating. Half of her is always obscured by the male. As with the twite, often only the male and the juvenile are illustrated, even though they differ from the female. If you were lucky enough to see a female ortolan bunting in the field, you could not identify her. She's been erased. Perhaps it's not surprising. Birdwatching has always been predominantly a male interest, and bird books are predominantly written and illustrated by men. This guide, the third edition published in 1974, is dedicated to the author's long-suffering wives. Below the dedication is a quotation from the Merry Wives of Windsor. She laments, "Sir, her husband goes this morning a-birding." Those authors are heirs of the men who determined how we apprehend the breathing, growing world around us. Small groups of Oxbridge graduates and Anglican ministers who formed clubs that admitted new membership by invitation only, who wrote voluminously to one another, traded skins and eggs and specimens, furthering the aims of empire abroad and experimenting with empiricism at home, where their wives and daughters wrote up their catalogues and dusted their display cabinets. Of the 91 people identified in biographies for birdwatchers, only 3 are women. I checked my other Collins Field Guide. This one, published in 1972, has a larger geographic range, the birds of Britain and Europe with North Africa and the Middle East. Here, the female bullfinch is perched below instead of behind the male. Above them, the postures and placement of the male and female siskin aesthetically mimic theirs. Next to the bullfinches perch the greenfinches, the female below the male, the juvenile below the female. On the next page, the male hawfinch is in the foreground, partly obscuring the female hawfinch, whose head is decorously bent. Below them, the pattern of the desert finches is the same, where the females of some species are in the foreground, their posture is horizontal, or they're below, not above the male. Even if the male and female of the species are the same size, she's often shown smaller in the background, or if the differences occur only on the head or head and breast, this is all of her that is illustrated. More suggestive yet, with some species, such as the wheatears, hooded, pied, mourning, red-rumped, the females are shown a third the size of the males. Only the males are also illustrated in flight. There are exceptions, but in the vast majority of illustrations of sexually dimorphic birds, the male dominates, the female is secondary. And the text...
It's powerful stuff, isn't it, actually? It really does challenge, like you said, and this is, it's always about the kind of commodification of language, because we talk about female birds being dull or duller, We don't talk about them being, in a word that I can't think of, but in a different way of describing that attribute.
And I go on to explore how the text mirrors the illustrations. And yes, the female's always described in relation to the male, as less something, as lacking something.
Yeah. I think there's an exception, which is birds of prey, because I think generally female birds of prey are larger, aren't they, than the males?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. But amazingly, even though female sparrowhawks are larger than male sparrowhawks, the longest time I had difficulty identifying sparrowhawks, and I finally figured out, not sparrowhawks, but whether it was male or female, and I finally figured out that my formative experience, it gives sparrowhawk size as a range. It doesn't say the female is larger than the male. The size of sparrowhawks ranges from the male size to the female size. Yeah. So I early on, I internalized that misrepresentation.
So we've all got to go home now and interrogate our field guides.
It's not, and to be fair, later field guides don't do this, because obviously this reflects...
That was an important distinction to make.
Yes,
No, but there is a whole thing about gender, isn't there, in the birding world? I mean, I sometimes go up to Scotland to give talks in a hotel up there, and they do wonderful celebrity-guided wildlife weeks, but all the celebrities are male, without exception. And a friend got in touch this morning. I mean, this is a sellout event. We're delighted about that. And he wasn't able to come, but he said this would have been the first talk about birds that he would have been to see with a female. Now, I mean, this is important stuff, right? It's about how we commodify and think about where, the spaces that we should inhabit. So, So I think it's brilliant what you've done there, Yeah, and it's a book really about process, isn't it? It's about, I mean, the literary essay, I mean, don't go and, don't collapse in a heap, the essay, the literary essay is a very different thing, isn't it, to what people might think of as the essay that we all had to do at school or college. It's much more a kind of discursive, exploratory field of writing where I think you're really trying to examine what you want to say through the process of writing. So do you want to talk a bit about the essay and what you were doing with that? Because I just think it's a really wonderful way of writing.
In a way, it's simply a product of me most of the time not knowing what I want to say or not knowing what I think, and writing is my way of trying to figure out what do I, it might be some major event in the world, it might be some minor personal thing going on, whatever it is, but I resort to writing, not public writing, but private writing, to try and figure out what do I think, what do I feel, where do those things conflict, what's getting in the way of me being able to act or whatever. And then sometimes that turns into, public writing that where I feel like I want to communicate something. So these essays definitely came out of that process of trying to figure out what I had to say, but also came out of a really strong disinclination to presume to say and to not claim knowledge that I don't have, and to find a way to explore a way to kind of share thoughts about something without making statements, and to share information without telling, without imposing, and without presuming. So in a way, all through the book there's this kind of unease or discomfort or questioning of expertise, and how do we handle expertise? How do we deal with other people's expertise, which I hugely appreciate other people's expertise, but how do how do you share expertise without appearing to assume that the other person doesn't know, and that you've kind of got the authority to share it. So that was definitely all part of the process, but these are very personal essays as well. They're first-person essays, so they might be exploring an idea, but I'm also exploring it through what does my experience tell me about this idea? So yes, I think it's a wonderfully flexible writing form.
It is, and there's an American author, Philip Lopate, who talks about it like it's an intimate conversation that you're listening into if you're reading an essay. And Jonathan Franzen talks about how it's something hazarded. It's not authoritative. It's the writer working things out on the page and being able to express self-doubt. And I think sometimes as writers, we kind of think, oh, we're not allowed to go there. But voice is really important in the writing, isn't it? And how we manage or manipulate it, what we allow ourselves to see and what we allow the readers to see in the writing.
Definitely. And there's that fine balance between doubt and uncertainty and confusion. And I don't think... I don't think readers appreciate being confused by what they're reading. So I certainly don't. And so I wouldn't want another reader to take that away from something I've written. So there's a management of self-doubt, a management of uncertainty. It's part of a process. It's not a thing in itself.
And it results in you becoming an authority because of that exploration. So I think expressing self-doubt and managing it in the way you say is a kind of really useful tool. actually.
Well, and we're all authorities on our own experience, aren't we? So that's the one place where you can, no one can presume to tell you. Well, and that doesn't actually stop people from telling you what your own experience is, but there's and go on and say it's not just a book about birds at all. It's about an analysis of what happens in that kind of wider sphere, and it's about human processes as well. So did you want to say something about that? About how, like in the first essay, you're actually talking about somebody with cancer, right? So that's an illness. We're all part of nature, but guess what? We get ill as well, and we're all kind of in it together. Yeah, and I like that because we don't often get that in such a way that's really looking at the process of what's happening. Yeah, I think it's it's as much a book exploring our relationships to one another as it is our relationship to non-human species. I'm uneasy with the more than human expression, that
really
is in use now, rather than the non-human. I understand why people reject non-human to designate species that aren't human, but the more than human feels just as clunky. So I still prefer, I think, to say non, or just to talk about the animate world. I think that's also another way to kind of encompass other living things. But so the first essay is about processes in the body. My sister died of breast cancer quite a few years ago now, but the essay sort of, I think one of the things that you can do in an essay is you can go to a lot of different places and come back to your central theme or image or idea or narrative, but take a lot of digressions along the way and sort of build a larger, something that's a bit larger than just the sum of its parts.
Yeah, definitely.
So that essay I really wanted to explore quite widely, and so there's memory of me and my sister and having cage birds as children. There's stuff about having a bird in the house and what the folklore of a bird in the house means, and about your own body as a natural environment, and illness as a natural process too. And then the final essay is also about an experience of illness that I had, and some reflections on this whole idea of the natural when it comes to our own bodies, and what does that mean.
Is this a good place to talk about the sheep's leg?
Okay, yes, also a natural process.
Yeah, because I mean, there's one line where you say the natural world is not glorious, but a matter of implacable drives, which I really like. We as humans, we're often top down imposing our worldview onto the natural world, and it's often very jumbled actually. But we're the only species that can try and make sense of things, right? But there's this process of decay that goes on that's part of it, and you found a sheep's leg and took it home.
Yeah, I was it was a time where I was just trying to challenge in myself, the kind of the boundaries of disgust and my fascination that felt somewhat taboo as well with dead things. And I mean, I don't think in a weird way, or maybe a slightly weird way, bringing home a sheep's leg, but I brought the sheep's leg home thinking, well, I just want to look at it, and I wasn't even sure why I was bringing it home, and then watch it decay, and it didn't last long because it really stank. But a lot of that essay, but again, a theme through the book is that aspect of the natural world and our own world that we are so sort of detached from, of death and decay and rot and maggots and bad smells and all the ways that we kind of protect ourselves from the things that make us uncomfortable. So there's quite a lot about dead bodies and unseemly bodily processes and so on. Yeah.
And again, that's really refreshing. And then talking about language itself, and you get. I really like this bit where you get into metaphor and anthropomorphism, And there's an essay that deals with an osprey observation post at an RSPB reserve in Wales. And you say, you know, that poor osprey has been anthropomorphized to death, basically. And that, and you wrote this, and it stuck with me, this phrase, the wood pigeon is not demented, the wren is not cocky. And I think that's really interesting, that we fall back on these ideas of imposed on what other animals are and what their experience is, but it's only our experience at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, you know, you watch a dunnock creeping along carefully by, you know, and it's mouse-like, or
yeah,
it's timid, definitely. Or it's, you know, and I mean, it is, but it's obviously, it's got its own sort of threats that it's dealing with, and it's adapted to the threats in its environment. But of course, we're projecting our own human apprehensions onto whatever we see. I think it's such a taboo in nature writing to anthropomorphize, and it's seen as, you know, it can be very sentimental, it can be presumptuous, it's unscientific, it sort of delegitimizes in a way. And yet we all anthropomorphize because we're human, so we see the world in human terms. I mean, we have the power of imagination. We can project ourselves into the experience that other species have, but we're still doing that within the constraints of human cognition, and the very act of doing it and seeking to do it is a human endeavor. So I'm a bit, I guess I question the absolutes against anthropomorphism. I think it's probably more useful and more accurate, really, to simply recognize how we anthropomorphize and accept that we do, and explore what that does. Does it enable us to have a relationship, for example, to a slug? I'm not crazy about slugs. I mean, they're okay. Wasps, I have a wasp phobia, so wasps would be, it seems like a slightly odd thing for somebody who writes about natural world to have phobias about the natural world.
I think we're all allowed one, aren't we?
Okay, I'm allowed one, right. So me, it's wasps. Of course, I anthropomorphize what a wasp does when it's coming at me in that aggressive, nasty way. Both of those words, aggressive, nasty way. And yet, by the same token, exactly that element of imagining what the wasp is doing has also enabled me to question that reaction, and to sort of see the wasp as an entity in its own right, and to try and not humanize it, but to accord it the same dignity and the same rights, if you like, as any other species. So I don't think anthropomorphism on its own is just an evil, but it's something I think we need to talk about more.
Need to talk about. And do we also need to talk about what we mean when we talk about nature writing? Then?
Oh God, do we ever? Yeah.
We've talked about this before, but I mean, what I find myself now even not wanting to use the term nature writing, and I teach, and my students, I do a lecture on nature and the environment, but I actually don't know what to call this lecture anymore. It's so. Let's get into this.
Okay.
We agreed we would, but you know, what are some of the problems around the term, do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, at the very least...
Or what are some of the complexities?
Oh, what are some of the... well, there are all sorts of complexities. I mean, it's contested, isn't it? So as soon as you've got a term for a certain genre, then you've got definitions. So what's in and what's out? Who gets to decide what's in and what's out? What's legitimate and what's not legitimate? And just as in the birdwatching world, obviously largely in the science world, but certainly in the nature writing world, we've got to use quote marks.
Yeah, we have to use it. We're just going to use it by default.
It. It's a certain demographic that has set itself up as the gatekeepers of what is and isn't okay in nature writing. But to me, nature writing as a term is it's a bookshop term. It's a marketing and
publishing term.
Publishing term, and it's a teaching term. It enables us to say we're teaching nature writing and not other forms of non-fiction. Just like creative non-fiction is a teaching term. It means nothing outside of that context. And I think nature writing I think we do need a new term because, in fact, writing that has really taken off in popular terms, publicly, for a lot of people who call themselves nature writers, is anathema. It's not nature writing. For example, women writing memoirs that are set in the natural world, but aren't necessarily primarily focused on the natural world.
And that's not their fault, right?
They're not
the
calling
marketing
it.
tool.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I never called this nature writing, and I'm sure that there are certain purists who would certainly see it not as being nature writing. There are problems with calling it nature writing, but a publisher has to market it a certain way, and that's just, you know, a fact of the
just
market.
how it is, yeah.
But the reality is there's such a hugely popular genre, the nature writing memoir, that it's actually displaced an enormous amount of natural history writing. And I think maybe that's where a useful division could perhaps be determined. We you know, with long tradition and history of natural history as a form of writing, which takes a much more detached, observational, scientific approach, and which comes with all sorts of obligations and conventions, and then other stuff, you know, which could be anything from, you know, a very personal response to an encounter with the wild. You know, I did an event recently with somebody who's done a book about living in a village not that far from where I live, and she's a Londoner, and it's all new and exciting and interesting. And she keeps talking about being in the countryside. Well, it's jarring for me because I don't even recognise the term the countryside,
yeah.
but
Or what it is.
Or what it is. So, but there's. It's a very popular book. It's something that a lot of people have enjoyed, and it's an approach that is completely as legitimate as any other.
Absolutely
it's
valid. It's just the legitimization and the the marketing.
And who's policing it?
Yeah. And it's not often a conversation we have, but I think it's, again, like the gender thing, it's really important to have.
And this tends to be a very gendered, it's contested in largely
many
gendered,
ways, and race
gender terms. And race, yes.
So
absolutely.
acknowledging all that, and going back to where you live, there's a bit where you talk about the animals that you share your house with, which it's really lovely, and made me feel very guilty about the odd time we get a mouse in the house and all I want to do is get it out, you know. But do you want to talk a bit about that, about the animals? I mean, there was a list. I've gone out of order now, but this is in or around your house, right? I hope maybe they're all in. Swallows, you've had swallows, and polecats, wood mouse, bank vole, common shrew, pipistrelle bat, and bees. That's just some of them.
Oh, that's just some of them, and those are all in the house.
In the house.
In the house.
So a polecat in the house.
Uninvited, yeah. Well, a polecat who left its leavings in the house.
Left its leavings, that's right, yeah.
But polecats around the house, yes. I've had polecats outside the house. I've also had a ewe in my house, and her lamb, which was also uninvited. I live in a very porous house. Obviously, the ewe came in when the door was open, but the other species, I think
uninvited guests.
Uninvited guests. I think it's 8 species of mammal have been in or I cohabit with. I mean, not in my living space. They're in the attic. They're in the roof. They're in the walls, and I can, you know, that's fine with me. When they start coming in the kitchen or in my bedroom or whatever, and it's voles. It tends to be voles, not mice. I was told I had a better class of mouse. I mean, I could read a passage from that. Shall I read a passage?
Oh yeah, that'd be brilliant.
From that?
Absolutely.
Because
perfect
it's sort
timing.
of illustrative. Let me see where we are. Some people, some of you perhaps, would be horrified by the feral way I live. But even if I tried, I could not keep my neighbours out. I live in a porous 18th century traditional stone buthin. Its near metre-thick exterior walls are rough stone, built in 2 skins that are pinned and filled with rubble, typical of the vernacular architecture of rural Wales. The pitched roof, built of pine rafters under slate, rests on black oak beams, and tongue and groove boards make up the interior walls and ceilings. The back door used to be warped, and on a windy day the curtain drawn across it would billow into the room. The old single glazed sash windows used to tremble and buzz with passing traffic, and in spring it was impossible to sleep beyond dawn because the birdsong was so loud. Since I got the door and windows replaced, I've missed the immediacy of the dawn chorus, though not the loud noise of the passing traffic. But even with double glazing and a new tight-fitting door, my home is still full of entryways, the walls hollow with invisible tunnels, the attic undisturbed. My house is more access to shelter than barrier against incursion. It keeps the weather out, but lets in those seeking respite from weather. There are the mammals and insects everywhere, visible and invisible, and their evidence, that of woodworm in particular. I've got masonry bees. Mason bees. Masonry bees. Mason bees. There's quite a serious number of bees in the house. Shall I just read the swallow passage as well?
Yeah, definitely.
Every spring, when the swallows return, I'm faced with the dilemma: should I let them in? It begins almost as soon as they arrive. On a warm April day, if I leave the back door open, within minutes a swallow will be swooping around, checking it out. The exposed beams in my dark, barn-like living room offer just the kind of sheltered high place where swallows like to nest, and often a pair will sweep around the open door persistently, back and forth, circling round, hesitating, sliding away and returning. When they've come in, I've always chased them out. But what if, I wonder every year, what if I leave them alone? What if this one chooses to nest here? What if I let her? Every spring I wait for their return. Every spring part of me wants that dark blue shimmer of hollow bone and stiff feather to take the risk. Each time I wonder about leaving a small window open and giving over my living room to them. The floor is old quarry tile, and I'd cover the furniture. Their mess would do no damage. The mess and the noise of nestlings would only be an inconvenience for a few weeks. In recent years, there have been fewer and fewer swallows near my house, and there are fewer and fewer places available for them to nest. Barns are converted into holiday cottages or knocked down to make way for chicken sheds. Outbuildings are made into garages or garden offices or guest rooms. Entryways everywhere are being sealed off and blocked up or netted. But despite the loss of swallow nest sites year on year, every spring I shut my door to them.
It's really interesting because also what that speaks to is the genetic memory of these animals, and they were called barn swallows for a reason, and even now I've seen places in Europe where people are sharing their dwelling places with these birds, so perhaps the bird's genetic memory travels back a lot further in time than ours does, and it puts a different perspective altogether on that animal's experience of living and what it expects to find in terms of habitats.
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
Is this a good place to kind of segue a bit into, without going too deep because we haven't got time, about what concerns about climate and biodiversity loss? I mean, I think if we're going to call it nature writing, one of the things that it does do, and it has done without question, is to communicate all kinds of ideas and ways of reconnecting people to the natural world in a way that we weren't. I mean, I think we can probably lay the blame completely at the door of modernity, of what it did to us, the post-war generation, industrial farming, all kinds of things. But what do you think about, as writers, what can we do to look at this, to look it square in the eye, but then deal with it, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, it's hard to really know how to answer that, because my instinct as a writer is to say that, good writing results from writing really what you care passionately about and what you're and bad writing often results from resorting to being didactic, from writing about either writing in a way where you're self-censoring or writing out of a compulsion to to tell and to educate and to change. Obviously, very effective writing happens in that mode as well. But so as a writer, I sort of flinch slightly at the idea that we ought to be addressing a particular thing, or we ought to be doing any particular, taking any particular act. Not that I think we ought not, but that how each of us individually, writers or not, deal with the enormity of what we're facing with climate change and species loss. It has to come from inside. I mean, we have to feel invested in what we're doing rather than feel bullied into doing things that aren't actually sustainable for us individually to do. Everybody's circumstances are different, and everybody has to make their own adaptation to what we're told broadly and repeatedly we ought to be doing. We ought to drive less, we ought to do this, we ought to do that. It's not necessarily possible for everybody.
The world is suffused with guilt, isn't it?
And absolutely. And I don't think we tend to change when we feel cornered, when we feel guilty, when we feel frightened either. Yeah. And there's a lot to be afraid of, and we should be frightened. I mean, we are facing such disastrous circumstances, and yet that doesn't facilitate change in our behaviour, I think. So. And
we can't save what we don't love, and we can't love what we don't know. It's that whole conundrum, isn't it? If we're not aware of it, we can't. How can we possibly act?
Absolutely. So there are a number of different ways to approach what needs to be done. And I don't think if you're writing about the natural world, you absolutely must write about climate change or species loss. Yeah. But increasingly, if you don't, you're going to look pretty clueless and pretty self-serving, and the market on some level will also determine whether that's going to be a sort of a successful exercise as a writer or not. But I think there are many different ways that we can address the nature crisis, and one element that needs to happen is to enable people to relate to it personally rather than to feel completely overwhelmed, and to be able to make small changes and to feel recognized that their particular experience and their particular capacity to do things is recognized and acknowledged and valued, rather than it be sort of so global and universal. So I think as with any ethical conundrum that we're facing as a species, there are a number of ways to approach the problem, but I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all.
I think that's a really helpful and kind of nuanced way of approaching it, And thank you very much for that. I mean, we have got about 10 minutes left, and there was a whole raft of other questions which we've run out of time to talk about. But let's turn it over to you guys and see if anybody's got questions for Jasmine. Hello, yes?
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for reading as much as you've got.
I'll repeat the question back and then people at the back can hear.
I'm currently exploring reflective practice through my own PhD at the moment, and really looking at things that perhaps when I experienced them at the time seemed normal, and when you look back you realise how perhaps disturbingly old they were. And I can hear the reflexive work through your own project, and I'd just really like to know whether there's many things that you have looked back on since writing that book to think, that was strange. How did I think that was normal at the time, and how it perhaps has changed your view of how is it possible to see things now that you didn't see before?
Did anybody hear that? Could you get that at the back? It's a question about the sort of practice of reflection in the writing, and whether looking back at the end of the writing process you see things differently. I think I've paraphrased that correctly? Okay.
And also the other part of the question about things that happened in the past that seem normal, that subsequently in the present.
For example, the field guide was a great example where now you're looking back and you think, how could you not see it?
Well, one of the threads through because there is a narrative thread through the essays, which is why I'm never quite sure if they're chapters or essays, is the experience of domestic violence. which I experienced a long time ago, and which at the time obviously felt like my normality. And writing about it's been very challenging. I mean, it's not a particularly overt thread. You know, this is not a misery memoir.
No,
it's
not
not
at
a
all.
recovery memoir
Anything
at all.
but.
So it's really actually an exploration of fear and how fear operates. So there's also fear in climbing and fear when confronted by
A stranger.
something,
Yeah.
it's a stranger or something very wild looking me in the face. So I think the process of writing about things in the past that seemed normal and unremarkable. So there's that. Sorry, I'm just, there's a lot to say.
It's a big question.
In response to that, because it's a really
Yeah.
interesting question.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't touched on actually at all is the naturalist Henry Baker Tristram,
Yeah.
who's from Durham, and he's my current research project. He's going to be the subject of my next book. He spent a lot of time in Palestine in the mid-19th century and was really responsible for establishing Palestinian ornithology and was a founder member of a lot of our ornithological organizations that exist till now. He's a really vivid writer, really vivid travel and nature writer. But naturally, of course, he had certain imperial and racial attitudes that come through extremely strongly in his work, and haven't actually been remarked on yet. So he's recognized as a really important figure, but not as a really problematic figure. In the period, totally normal. Now, really troubling. So I think that process of writing about the past inevitably, whether it's about someone else or your own experience, inevitably is going to make the past look different. And then the question, how do you deal with the fact that you're applying present-day values to behaviour in the past?
The eternal question,
That's
isn't it? Yeah.
really just very tricky.
So, anybody else? We've got somebody here. This lady. So did anybody not hear?
It's not really a question.
It was an observation about a photograph in a book of a coal tit taking the fur off a dead rat, and about I think it's a question about perception and about the kind of processes we were talking about earlier. Let's try and fit one more question in as well.
I'll answer very briefly.
Yeah.
No, it's a wonderful image, you know, of other species don't romanticize what's available to them or what the world around them looks like, whereas we do. And it's just a good illustration of that, and maybe something for us to keep in mind.
There's a gentleman here.
You mentioned right at the beginning of your excellent talk that you love birds. I just wondered if you could elaborate on why they bring you so much joy and inspiration.
That's
So
such a
why birds bring Jasmine such joy and inspiration?
It's a really hard question, and I get asked it often. Why birds? What is it about birds? And I don't really know, but my approximation is this, that they're so immediately present and so with us, they're so around us all the time, in a way that other species aren't immediately obvious. And they're so lively and so vivid, and as soon as you really pay attention, whether it's your limping urban pigeon, or the robin that's, waiting for you to finish digging over your vegetable bed, they're so accessible in some way. They're so much our neighbours. That we're living with them all the time. And they confront us all the time with what it is to not be human. And it's something about that relationship that's yeah.
Have we got time for another quick? Can we keep them fairly brief, gentlemen here?
I was going to ask you about whether or not you, I mean, it's sort of part of a larger question, but sort of, do you think that there is a connection between a lack of accessibility to nature and the gatekeeping of what is and what is not nature writing? And if people don't, if they live in an urban environment, a lot of people, I think, like, there is nature everywhere, and that urban environments are not devoid of nature. We live in here.
It's a really good point.
How many trees,
Yeah.
panels, these walls and things like that, but do you think that therefore because people can't feel that connection to nature because they think, well, I live in an urban environment, that means there can't be nature, and so then if there is nature writing that does sort of intertwine with any sort of more relatable, I suppose, like urban concepts, that then they think, well, that can't be nature because nature is just, it's the countryside, it's somewhere else.
Well,
Yes.
that's a really good point. It's a point for those who might not have heard about the kind of porosity, I guess, between the urban and the natural, or the perceived natural. What we think of in this country as the natural often is devoid of wildlife, actually, and there's sometimes more wildlife in cities. So it's like...
I think you've sort of answered the
And about
question,
accessibility.
Really. Yeah, I mean, I think the gatekeeping of what constitutes nature writing is a major problem with recognising that the natural world is all around us, and we can have you don't have to get out into nature. I hate that expression, getting out into nature.
Yeah.
We're living with it. We're living, you know, we are not an isolated species in these plastic boxes. I mean, we have cockroaches and fleas and, you know, whatever we have. I don't have fleas, I'm not saying that. But, and yes, I think recognising the complexity and the richness of every environment is only going to help widen access to a sense of what the natural world is, but also enable us more widely to value what we have and protect it and maybe nurture it and let it grow a bit.
I think that's a great question, an excellent way to end the session. We're just about out of time, but Jasmine will be signing books at the back, so you might be able to carry on bits of this conversation afterwards. Just to say thank you very much indeed for coming to what's been an absolutely brilliant session. Thanks to Jasmine, thanks to the sponsor and the festival, and look forward to seeing you later on. If any questions, either ask myself or one of the stewards. Okay, so thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you.
You're probably to wait.